Welcome to the next presentation. Moritz is here today in our studio, and Moritz was discussing the API with us a lot over the past couple of months, and he's going to give you an overview what our goals are, where we're at right now, and also, Moritz, go ahead. I'm happy you're here. Hi, good morning. Okay, then I'm going to get started. Let's get started right away. So, most recently, I've actually spent most of my time on the Check API, and now I can show you the results. And I would like to get started by summarizing why it was necessary to begin with, and also why do we have to build a new Check API. In the past, we used to have 30 plugins, and we had a sort of Check API all the time. It was working quite well with 30 plugins, so it wasn't a problem at all. And now we have 1,920 plugins as of last week. And of course, also lots of third-party checks on the exchange, and people have their own adaptions and adjustments, etc. So of course, it's just so much. We don't have a good overview anymore. That's why we need a new API that's standing on solid ground, basically. And our goal was to really make it that we change the way plugins are written, obviously an improvement from our point of view. And the two main goals were to make sure that the Check plugins are normal Python modules, and they're supposed to have a versionized, well-defined API to import. So the Python modules, that would be the Python or way how software is packaged and how elements are made available to other people. And because of that, because of the fact that in the future we are going to sort of use a standardized way, a lot of the problems that are existing right now, problems that we've discussed yesterday, are going to be resolved by itself, basically. And that's a very important point, and I'm going to talk about that in more detail later on. A year ago, I actually gave you a similar presentation. It was all very much future-oriented. We promised that we want to transform all the plugins to the Python modules. And now we're at a point where the existing plugins, and we already knew that we can't actually do 1,900 plugins in such a short period of time, specifically migrating manually. And Lars already said that we switched them to Python 3. That wasn't a lot of work, but of course, adapting them to a completely new API is a lot more work, and that just wasn't possible. And there were two options. One option would have been to actually support both APIs at the same time. However, the new API, there are some conceptual changes, which is why we decided against that, because that would have been so much work. And that is why we now chose a different path. We said that the existing plugins automatically, if you load them, they're automatically in the format of the new API, so they transform to that. I'm calling that auto migration, and I'm going to tell you more about that later on, just to show you how well it works. And auto migration has a big benefit, which is that it also can work for plugins that people have at home. So there's really no action necessary. And I'm going to tell you more about that later on. So now I would like to just show you the general principles of the Check API. So what were the design drivers, and also, just the principles that everything's based on and all the things that we wanted to achieve. And it's going to be 5 points overall, and I'd just like to talk about them bit by bit. The first thing is that we want to have conventions, and that's why we just want more consistency, basically. And if things are consistent, it's always good. Of course, there's some conventions now already. However, very often they're just implied, and being an outside party, it's very difficult. Or also, if you're a new colleague, it's very difficult to figure them out. And for example, we would also like to make it where we just have more consistent names. So if you now program a Check plugin, you have to use the 3 keys that are listed here. So the Check function, the default levels variable, and also group. And at first glance, it's not visible how they're related, but that's going to be renamed. So it's still going to be check function, but then it's going to be called check default parameters and check rule set name. So you can see the three names and you can see right away that it's three things that belong together. The next point I'd like to discuss is that we want to make sure that things that do the same thing, so things that are solving the same problem, basically, they're also supposed to look the same. And right now we have the problem that in many different points we have different things in terms of how we solve problems. That's just based on our history. The most extreme example would be the rules for discovery features. So if you've programmed that before, you know that it's not obvious at all in terms of how it works. And it's also not very obvious why it works differently. So that means that we change that. And there are now three keys, similar to the three keys that we just saw for the check. And this is also now available for the discovery function, the discovery default parameters, and the discovery rule set names. So it's very analog. It's also doing the same thing, basically, because it's really the same problem that it's solving, or it's supposed to solve. The next point would be that we want to make implicit, explicit. That's not just our idea, but specifically when it comes to Python program, that's one of their bases, basically. And we don't want anything to happen automatically, and then you may not even know what has happened and is still going to work or may not work, etc. So cluster compatibility is definitely a very, very good example for that, because that's creating problems again and again. We saw that yesterday in our session as well. And check plugins that aren't explicitly programmed to be cluster compatible. They may still work on the cluster, but it's just implied sort of, so it can make sense or it can also not make sense. In the future, that's not what we want. We just want them to be sort of explicit or not work at all. We just don't want something to happen in the background that you can't even know. Another example is a parse function. So I can just maybe tell you what that is. A parse function is the part of the check plugin that takes the raw data and then processes that, and then actually does a semantic sense, basically. So before that, you just have a list of words, and afterwards, because of a data structure, you can just see content, basically, and you can also just delete lines that you're not interested in and things like that. So that is now optional, and we've noticed that very often problems can be solved by just making it where it's a function, and in a new API, this parse function has to be very explicit, because then you're going to have to do it anyways. I mean, the data actually has to have a semantic meaning. The only question is that happening randomly in this line a little bit, that line a little bit, or do you just bundle it in one place? And the last thing, from our point of view, makes a lot more sense, and that's why we decided to do that. Okay, then the fourth point would be that we don't want any unnecessary functions. So we want to get rid of them right now, because also that's based on our history. There are a lot of functions that do very similar things. So let's say somebody had a specific need, included that feature, and then it's just there, and then it's just more and more and more over time, but really you don't need them anymore. So what we see, for example, if you've programmed an SNP check, you may know that. So there are these constants, and there's 7 of them. And if you look at what they're doing actually, and also how they're interacting with each other, you notice that you only need 3 of them. And because of that, we said, okay, we're only going to keep 3 of them. And the plugins that are the other ones are using are still going to work, but they're not going to be around in the future because they have to be limited to these 3 elements. But of course, you can do everything now that you were able to do with the 7 previous ones. However, now you have the benefit that it's could be done in the same way. Another example would be a check function can now be a function, a classic function, so you have an input and you have an output, or it can be a generator function. A generator function is different because you have the possibility to get several results in a simplified way. So, of course, it's very, very obvious. If you only have one result, then, of course, you can use the generator function because it's not forcing you to send back several results, but it just gives you the option. And that's why right now both options are possible, but we're saying it's not necessarily to allow both. In the future, feature, it's only going to be the generative function because that gives you all the options anyways, right? But it's going to be one solution. It's not going to be either or. Okay, and then the fifth thing is that we really want a fail early principle. So right now we have a problem, which is that you can plug in and you can maybe also load it. And at one point in time, something may happen. So something that you didn't predict because you have a return set and there may be some subtle mistakes in there, or maybe you just wrote something that doesn't make any sense, or there's a typo in there or whatever. So just errors like that. So they all have the same problem, that they just happen too late, and I don't want that. So what we want is we want to learn about errors as quickly as possible, and or any fails, and also don't want any stack trace that is just sent from somewhere within Checkmk, but instead I just want an error message that just helps you and that says, okay, you can't it doesn't fulfill this characteristic or whatever, because your variable has the wrong amount, the wrong value, because of the right feature, it doesn't have the right amount of parameters, etc. So things like that I want to know about right away. And that is something that we ensured using different things. So for example, the fact that the checks are now Python modules, that makes testing a lot easier. And of course, you can also run them previously. You don't have to set a deploy for it to work. You can do it ahead of time as well. So that is already very helpful. And the most important thing is that we don't only fill a dictionary as we do right now, because that works for everything. You can also have some values that don't make any sense. It will work. However, what we want instead, we want to have a register feature that directly when you're loading it checks if the values make sense. Can it even work or not? And if it can't work, then it's not going to let you do it. So you just get a warning right away or a notification. So now, again, very specifically, what does that mean for you if you develop a check plugin? Okay, so I really can't point it out enough. The Python modules are module plugins, so that means that you can run them separately. And you can also build unit tests, grade tests, which is what you're supposed to. And you can actually use all the IDEs. Of course, there are so many tools that give you all different error messages, etc. And the work of this tool, because the mechanism we have right now is really, really made very difficult. All of you have tried it before, you've noticed it, I'm sure. And we thought it was very important that if we now program the new check API, this type of problem cannot occur anymore. So it's just a standard procedure so that all the development environments can work with it properly, and you only see the errors that are actual errors that can be solved. You're also going to know, or at least you probably will know if it worked or not. So if your check plugin is loading, it's not an exception when you're doing that, then the likelihood of you having done everything right is a lot bigger. And of course, we can't guarantee it. And there are always going to be some effects that will only pop up later, but the likelihood of you getting some bad surprise later on is very much reduced. And of course, we also have a lot of details, features that are adapted, names are clearer, and of course we also thought about, okay, what do we need specifically, what do we maybe not need, and are there things that we can separate from each other, things that may be mixed up right now. So a lot of different advantages to it. A lot of advantages that, like I said, like cluster logics have definitely changed behind everything, because there were always some problems with that and surprises as well. So now I would just like to talk about the auto migration again, which is what I've already mentioned at the beginning. So the good news is that the auto migration is probably going to be working for your plugin. Why do I know that? Well, because we have 1,920 plugins, and there is a mistake in this number. 62 out of them had fails for the auto migration. Only 62. They're very complicated plugins though, and the likelihood of it working for you is quite good, and the plugin you have, you can just continue using it. Exception would be plugins that are cluster aware. They're not auto migrated. So it turns out that we can't do that in a reliable way. So in that case, you're going to have to do it manually. Unfortunately, we can't change that. However, you can see that this is a part of the 62 plugins where it didn't work. So even that isn't a lot. Okay, Moritz, I have a question myself about auto migration. Does that mean that my plugin has to be, or is going to be rebuilt in its place elsewhere? Or does it just mean that it's being used and it's just working still? It's only working, or it's only happening when it's running. So the file is only being read, as it is the case for code. You don't write anything into different folders. It's only being read. It's not being changed, but internally it's being restructured a little bit so that it's in line with the mechanics of the new API. So there are configuration files that are migrated, so they're going to sort of be rewritten with changes, but that's not the case here. No. So it just looks like it's just working, and it looks like it's still using the old API. Yes, correct. Of course, you could also not even mention that it's happening, but it's not happening in 100% of the cases, but only 96% of the cases. That's why you should know what's happening. Okay, so there's a compatibility layer that the old plugins most of the time still work. Yes, correct. Okay, so you can take a deep breath, so you know that all the things you've built with a lot of work is still going to work. And if you then feel like it, you can also look at the new API. Yes, correct. And also, if some of the checks that we've migrated that you wanted to look at, you can do that as well. So what can you do in order to be ready for the future, basically? One more slide, please. Next slide. Okay, how do you prepare for the new API? Well, there's a work. It's called 10601, and this is where you will also find some reasons why auto migration may fail, just so you can avoid them. Of course, this list is very, very short, but it's not at 0. So this is where you'll find 3 or 4 points, and if you avoid those, that'd be good. The most important example would be an SMNP scan feature that is very complicated. Complicated being that it's more than just one single that's sent back. So just so you know, we have about 1,000 SNMP plugins. 20 of them have that scan feature that is complicated. So again, it is probably not a problem for you. And you now say, "Ooh, it sounds as if the auto migration is not going to work for me," but you still want to write a new check plugin, and you don't want to have twice as much work. There are a couple points that you should be aware of, just to make sure that in the future, if you have to migrate it, you don't have as much work. So the first thing is that there's a parse function that needs to be implemented. I already mentioned that earlier, and that's going to be mandatory. Right now, it's optional, but if you already built it now, then you can just continue using it later on. But in the parse function, I can really write that it's trivial, right? Yes, you could do that, but I wouldn't recommend that. Like I said, very often what happens if we try to resolve errors, this is just one of the main points, So this is something that you can't overlook. It's very important. And like I said, you're going to need one, and you're going to have to do the work anyways. The only question is, are you going to do it right now, bundled, or are you going to do it later? I recommend you doing a parse function, but I mean, it's a matter of taste as well. Discover and check function, and I already mentioned that as well. In future, they're going to be generated functions. They're going to have to be, but they already can be that now. So just write that down. Just try to generate a function right now. Those that don't know what that means, that happens when I have a yield result and not return. As soon as you use yield as a generator function, that's just a Python term. Correct. And you can also use that right now. So that means why not do it right now? Because then you're going to have less work when you're migrating it later on. If you discover or want to discover host labels, you can already do that now. It's not something that's commonly done, though. That's why it's probably not going to affect a lot of people. If you want to do it, though, do it right away in a generator function, a separate one, because then you're not going to have to do so much work later on. It's very cryptic. All of this is going to change. But if you have the host labels in a separate function and you create it that way, then you have less work later on. The last thing is, if you have check that's supposed to be for clusters, then always assume that it's not like now. Right now, the data is sort of parsed at the same time. Please assume that the data is going to be received in a structure where you have a dictionary and you have the node name as a key, and then the data that belongs to this node is going to be bundled and it's going to be separately parsed, because that is what is going to happen in the future. And if you actually design your check plugin in a way that you can handle this type of data, then you're going to have less work later on when you're migrating. So those are my tips. But like I said, for many of you, this is not going to be a problem. It's just going to work. Okay, great. We have a lot of questions for you. So Robert asks, is there a command line tool to rebuild the plugins? So not the migration in the plugin, but I put my plugin in, click a button, and then you get a new file that's using a new API. Well, that was definitely something we considered, but we decided to go against that because there are some subtle specialties where you have to be very careful. And yeah, we just decided that instead we just wanted to use that energy to actually build that adapter first. That is going to give people some room. And to be honest, I don't know how much sense it would make because some things are slightly changing, the structure, the design, etc. So I do think it's going to be worth thinking about it for an extra 5 minutes because the new design is going to give you a lot of benefits. And I think if you migrate a Check plugin, it's going to be worth knowing the differences and also trying to figure out if you have a more robust and also more flexible plugin at the end of the day by just being a little bit smarter than the automated script. Okay, so that means that if the plugin is still working, there really isn't any need to do anything right now, and it's probably going to be a couple different Checkmk versions where it's still supported. We haven't thought about that yet, to be honest. We don't know how long we're going to be supporting that, but I don't see a reason that if the first day, for example, it works, then it's going to work until we stop it, right? So there's no reason why it should sort of break over time or something like that. Know what I mean? So if you are unlucky starting from day one, meaning you have a plugin that can't migrate automatically, then you're on the safe side. Okay, question from Anastos. Is the new Check API going to be described in the manual? Maybe we can also do a hands-on using a YouTube video. Well, the manual is definitely a very important point as well. And we actually didn't do that yet because the API is still being developed right now. But of course, it's going to be included. It's not going to be one item in our menu. It's probably going to be many of them. And step by step, they're going to be building on top of each other. And all the specialties are going to be described. So how do you do normal checks? How do you do specialized checks? How do you do clusters, etc.? And how do you work with thresholds, etc.? What do you do with exceptions and so on? So there are so many different aspects to be considered. And we're going to do that. That's also the reason why the existing Check description, the menu is a bit outdated because we're just waiting for the new API, and then we're going to have great new articles on that. And the tutorial videos, of course, that's always very interesting. We know that, and we are also going to try to do something when it comes to that. The only question is it going to be 10 or 50 hours to do that? But we're definitely going to think of something. I would like to add to that. Christoph showed you this morning what happens with the API. There's also going to be an automatically generated reference for us as well. And the difference would be that the manual, I would say, is just describing the different features and also the input parameters, but it also tells you about the good design, what kind of features you should use for what kind of purpose. So it's sort of explaining a lot also. And this thing's documentation is just a reference, right? It's sort of like a dictionary. You just look up what kind of features do I have, 3 features, but they're not explaining what kind of feature you're supposed to use. So it's really just something to look it up if you say, ooh, what was that again? Was it the first or the second one or whatever? You know what I mean? Where you can just look up things. That's also going to be available. So I think these two things should go hand in hand, and you should really have a reference point to look up things quickly and also a more extensive explanation that's going. Yeah, that's what we're going to have. A question from Kai. Is there a clean demo check that you could use as a blueprint and give to somebody? That's always a very fun topic, to be honest, because the copy and paste hell actually makes it that people actually install Check plugins that were up to date 10 years ago. We actually tried to do that before we had a so-called blessed checks, I think it was called. So it was a collection of examples. And yeah, maybe we're just going to pick that up again. Well, we actually discussed that topic in the session yesterday, twice actually. So that seems to be something that's very important to you. I can understand that too. The problem is, though, That is also just the type of information that you have to do maintenance on, because the best practice may change, and then all of a sudden the check that used to be great is not great anymore, or it turns out that it may even be bad or something like that. You sometimes don't know that ahead of time. Yesterday I already said that you should check the Git and also pick checks that are new. You can also go to the works and just see what kind of plugins are new, because that way there's no danger of just having an old standard from 10 years ago or something like that. Another option would be that you just look at changes in checks. So for example, if a developer, for example, had a check that he didn't like and he just restructured it 6 months ago, then the likelihood is very big that he did something that he liked. And of course, he also made it through the review. So at least 2 people think it's good. That's another alternative for you. And on top of that, of course, I also told you that there were 62 check plugins where the auto migration didn't work. So we're going to have to manually do that. And we're only going to do that with the 62 check-ins for the new API, so that you should also look at that. And as soon as we have that, of course, there are going to be examples as well. And those are the ones where we say, okay, this is the best way of doing it. And since we also have a manual team, we have more people now, so we're improving that. So hopefully we're definitely planning on making sure that's always up to date. It's not going to be outdated. So the examples that are going to be in the handbook are going to be up to date as well. Okay, now Jens Seifert is asking, and he has 13 votes, is there an IDE recommendation for non-Python developers? So if I'm not very experienced, you were talking about all the tools that are available. Okay, so of course that is a question that is being discussed in a lot of forums, so it's very, very difficult to give you a definite answer on that. I do know that we have some colleagues who are using PyCharm. They're very happy with that. There are also some colleagues that are using Spider, I think, with a Y. They also work Spider. To be honest, I'm not that familiar with it, so I don't know the feature set on that. But our developers, most of them are using a Vim with the corresponding tools. So it's definitely a matter of taste what you're using. Emacs also exists. They also have a big feature set, so at the end of the day, I think everybody's going to have to make their own decision. So those are the 4 I can think of right now spontaneously, and there should be something in there that you are going to like. Andreas also has a question. So what do you, or is there a description in terms of how you built the environment that the existing testing can be done? For example, pull request in GitHub, making it through that. Do we know how to do that? We don't know right now. As of right now, we have a, I'm going to call it framework that we set up ourselves. So, but it's sort of just something that just happened because our check plugins can't be tested properly right now. So if there are proper Python modules, then they're going to be classic unit tests that can be built without any special roles or anything like that. So you can just use a random tutorial and you can say, okay, how can I build a unit test? PyTest is the tool that we're using. And then just doing that. And of course, they're going to be somewhere, but I mean, I don't know right now. It's going to have to remain to be seen, I guess. The idea is completely right, though. The more tests come with it, the more likely it is that the pull request is going to work, because then we can actually understand it. I think Andreas was talking about him checking something before he submits something, just to make sure that it's in line with our guidelines. So he's programming a plugin, he wants to submit it by GitHub, so how can he make sure that it doesn't come back right away? So he can just check it himself. Oh, okay. Okay, so there are there's the 2 make files, and there are different targets in there: test unit, test pilot, test mypy, and I mean, you just have to run all of them. It's as easy as that. Okay, there are contribution guidelines. They're going to be updated as well. And that's what's going to include what you have to do before you hand something in so you can test it. Yes, that's going to be available, but a lot of things, for example, there's not only unit tests, but there are also a lot of other tests that just try to figure out that you are in line with standards and that you also may have done some mistakes or whatever, some errors or things that you shouldn't be doing. So all of that can be very different in terms of what kind of solutions there can be. And many of them we've activated already. And of course, they're going to be tested automatically as well. So if you actually run all the make targets, they're all green, then that's great already. Okay, great. All right, we're out of time now. We are done with our live session. However, we still have 2 minutes? Okay, and then of course we're going to have Q&A on stage 2, and Moritz is going to be available there if you have more questions. So you just have to give him 1 or 2 minutes so you can go back to the other room. 5 minutes? Yeah, I have to go to Metzstraße. Yeah, give me 5 minutes. All right, give him 5 minutes, but I'm going to run as quickly as I can. So Moritz is going to be there and answer all the questions, so don't be surprised if it takes a while. So we still have some time though. So Marcel is asking, Marcel Pollick, so because of the plugin migration, which is, does that mean that there's going to be some issues with performance? Well, when it comes to loading the plugins, you can tell, yes, but you're not loading them all the time. Okay, but if, well, our 1,900 plugins that are migrated automatically, is it going to be the same with them? Well, every time we have to change something with a plugin, of course, we are going to then put them on the API. Is that going to take a few years? Well, hopefully not. I mean, we can't make any promises, but it's only happening if you load them again. But the check helper does that, right? And in our new architecture, we're not going to have as many of them. Because, yeah, I agree. And also, again, the ones where it takes the longest, those are the problem candidates anyways. Yeah, and the few plugins that you created yourself are going to be fine, since we have a lot of ours as well. So there's no reason to switch your plugins. So don't worry about performance. Okay, great. All right, then we're done with the official part of it for this presentation. And Moritz is now going to go to Metzstraße, and he's going to be available for your questions in room 2 in a couple minutes, okay? All right, thank you very much for being here. We are going to take a short break, and then we're going to continue at 11:30 with Andreas Döhler and his monitoring. So see you in a little bit.